Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. Now, to get into some of the week's top business headlines and other topics with me today is Laura Fisaya Kolawole, Head Equities and Alternative Solutions, FB and Quest Asset Management. Thank you for joining me today, Laura. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Well, quite a bit to get through, but let's begin in Nigeria, where, of course, not the most colorful development as we've seen yet another spike in the inflation rate.
Absolutely.
Now, at 22.04%, some would immediately place this on the cash crunch, while others will say this is only the tip of the iceberg. For you, what would you attribute this rise to? And more importantly, what does this portend for the future in terms of economic shocks?
Thank you. So I think I'll start with your first question, which is where is it really coming from? And as you say, 22.04%. When you look under the bonnet, you look at core inflation. Core inflation really is inflation excluding the effect of food. Core inflation came in at 19.86%. What that tells you, being below 22, is that the real driver was food inflation, which was at 24.45%. Now, that food inflation was broad-based. So we're looking at all the kind of things that we eat every day. You're talking about things like yam, cereals. I mean, just name it, fruit, veg. All those kinds of things saw big increases in prices on a year-on-year basis in the month of March. But even the core inflation base, it was really broad-based. I mean, there was almost nothing that wasn't listed as a driver of inflation. You had areas like vehicle spare parts, medical services, fuel, so all these things that I think everybody in this market probably feels, because we all appreciate the fact that prices have been moving up. And so, yes, you're right. I think the cash crunch probably played a big impact, because with the cash crunch, what you had, or what you have seen, is that everybody has added something a little bit more on all the, on their prices, just to cover for the difficulties, I think, in getting cash, in paying for money, all those kinds of things. And, they often say that prices are sticky downwards. So you almost feel that even though cash has become a lot more available, you don't expect that people are going to reduce prices, in the same way as they have increased it up until now. So in terms of what it brings for the future, I think it's not surprising when you would expect that disposable income will remain constrained. And so until and unless we start seeing wages go up materially in response almost, you almost don't expect people to have more money in their hands. So I think that it really means that from the average man on the street, it will be, and it will continue to be difficult. I think if you were looking for a silver lining, the one thing that struck me was when you look at the rate of change in the months of, say, February and March. So in March, it was up 13 basis points. In February, it was up 9 basis points, When you compare it to January, when we came into the year where it was up over 40 basis points, I think, that rate of change slowing maybe is something that the central bank might take comfort in. So obviously, in response to inflation, they've been increasing interest rates. So we've seen interest rates move up to 18% in terms of the MPR. And the CBN has been very vocal in just making sure that everyone understands that policy needs to remain restrictive. So, perhaps that's a silver lining, that maybe the rate of change is moderating. But ultimately, I think inflation is here to stay.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of work needs to be done, even for us to see that silver lining to start with. But I mean, let's not end that on a bleak note, because let's move from there to the UK, where we almost seen the reverse of the case there, where, we've had it move from 10.4% to 10.1%. But that being said, in spite of that, the overall prices of food and non-alcoholic drinks has sort of been around 19% higher than it was last year. What's your assessment of this?
So I think that the UK, it's one of those places where, to be honest, I don't necessarily see the reading as good news. When you look at other sort of peer countries, or peer areas, so the European Union, for example, where inflation is at 6.9%, or you look at the US, where inflation is at 5%, and in those markets, we've seen inflation drop. The UK has not recorded a drop in inflation for 3 consecutive months. It has not been able to tackle. So it's a real picture of inflation being sticky downwards. It's been very, very stubborn. And when you look at the UK inflation picture, you can kind of see why. So the big driver of the inflation has been energy prices. The UK, unlike the US, is a net energy importer. So that means that they are taking price. Secondly, when you compare them to the European Union, they use a lot more gas. And so that has really meant that they have felt the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I think, much more than the peer countries. And that's the reason why they're the only Western European country with double-digit inflation at the moment. So it's something that is really concerning for the Bank of England, whose inflation target is 2%. So obviously 10% is like so far from where they, where they want to be. So for me, I don't see it as good news. And I think the second area that is difficult for the UK is that their labour market is very tight. So there is a real shortage of skilled workers in the UK. And as a result of that, wages are going up. So when you look at wages across the private sector and the public sector, as at February, wages in the private sector were up about 6.9%. In the public sector, it was a bit less, about 5-ish%, I think 5.3 or so. But that wage increase is a concern because it's feeding inflation. Yes, real wages are down to 0.4%, but ultimately, it really just shows that the price pressures are really still building in the economy. So when you think about the future and say, you know what, can the Prime Minister reach his goal? His main goal was, one of his main goals for this year, he had 5, but one of them was cutting inflation by half. And he sort of said very openly he needs to get inflation down to about 5% or so, or lower. I think it could happen. The one thing being energy price, the contribution of energy is meant to reduce from now on. So we would expect that from about April going forward, we would see that drop off as you enter the summer months.
What could stand in the way of that happening? And it's a good thing you mentioned the labour workers because this must be extremely confusing for them. On the one hand, you have, wow, yes, we have the inflation numbers dropping, but prices are going up.
Yeah.
So what are the realities around that actually happening, that leap happening?
So I think that, if we're looking at our own expectations, definitely we'll see inflation drop off. We do think that inflation will fall, especially as we get into the summer. Ultimately, because gas prices, which is really the driver of UK's inflation, as I said, they're a net importer of energy. As they move into summer, you expect to see, as the cold dissipates, heating needs reduce, that should see inflation come down. So we do think that the PM will meet his goal, which is to sort of halve inflation by the end of the year. It is doable. I think it's just a lot more stubborn in the UK just because I said of the dynamics that they're going through with their energy market and the labour market.
Right. But of course, with the UK, there is quite the scope for the silver lining there, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We'll have to wait
absolutely.
and see. Yeah.
Absolutely. The target will be reached. I think that's a good silver lining to take away, that they will meet their target of reducing inflation. It's just been a difficult journey. And I think workers are feeling, we all hear about the strikes across various areas in the UK. So, I think that people are feeling it and it's
people
tough.
are absolutely feeling it.
Yeah.
Right, well, let's move on to a more positive note. Well, something that appears a bit more positive, so that's China, where we have the first quarter GDP has seen a 4.5% growth.
Yes.
With China, just looking at the March activity data, it's quite interesting to see that China's recovery has really surpassed expectations.
Absolutely.
But do you see this performance as a precursor for more stimulus?
So I think that the data is good, to be honest. It was a beat, but it's kind of mixed as well. I think as with any economic data, to be honest, it's almost never all in one direction, right? So on the one hand, 4.5% in Q1. Markets were expecting about 4%. So it's a good start to the year. The government in China is expecting 5% growth in 2023. So 4.5 in Q1 is a respectable start to the year. And when you lift up the hood, if you would say, and you look at what's driving that, it's really been, first of all, consumption. So their retail sales numbers for the month of March, for example, was up 10.6%. Now, that tells us that consumer confidence is growing. People are going out there, they're spending money, which is ultimately, what will drive growth in any economy. When you go over to the other side, which is their industrial production as well, that was up 3.9% in the first quarter. Again, it's a real meaningful sort of number, just showing that the economy is getting there. It's getting where you want it to go. Some analysts have sort of said the fly in the ointment was really, there's a data point that China put out as well, which is called their private investment data. And that tells you about the confidence of entrepreneurs. It was up only 0.6%. So entrepreneurs aren't really spending, they're not really investing in businesses. And the market is taking that to mean that low entrepreneurial confidence is a problem. So there's a school of thought, for example, that says that the strong growth in Q1 was really just some activity that should have happened in Q4 that spilled into Q1 because the COVID, the reopening was still sort of new and just happening in the fourth quarter.
Right.
So that's been perhaps the flying zone, but I don't think so. I think that 4.5%, it's a fair start. I mean, even when you look at a number like the services PMI in China for the month of March, it was at 58.6, and it was driven by a broad, broad sectors. So everything from restaurants, catering, tourism, so the services sector, and that's over half of Chinese GDP. That sector is doing quite well. So I don't think it's a bad start to the year.
It's certainly a very fair start and extremely encouraging as well for the economy and others who are looking to leapfrog and get into that. So absolutely. Laura, I wish we had time to get through because it would have been good for us to talk about move from economies to stock performance. I don't know that we have enough time because we have Netflix stock we've seen due to poor profit forecast as well. Very quickly, do you want to just touch on that very briefly?
I will say the one thing I'll say about Netflix is I think a good-ish Q1, but the biggest thing was their password crackdown. So the guidance was not great for Q3 because they have come out to say that in Q2 they're going to broadly crack down on their 100 million or so users who share their passwords.
Which unfortunately is one of their key selling points. But we'll have to see how they navigate this creatively.
Exactly.
All right, Laura, I want to thank you so much for joining me this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
All right.